My fiancé invited his ex to our wedding and gave her the seat meant for my mother. If someone had told me 6 months ago that the biggest fight on my wedding day wouldn't be about flowers, money, or even cold feet, but about a chair, I would have laughed in their face. Turns out, that chair changed everything. So picture this. After almost 3 years together, my fiancé, Ryan, and I were finally getting married. We weren't rich, but we'd saved for a beautiful ceremony at a lakeside venue with about 100 guests. Every invitation had been carefully planned. Every table assignment had been double-checked, or so I thought. The week before the wedding, I was reviewing the seating chart with our planner when I noticed something strange. My mother's name wasn't at the family table. At first, I assumed it was a typo. My mom was supposed to sit in the front row during the ceremony and then at the head table during dinner, right beside my grandparents. Instead, her name had been moved to table 14, tucked into a corner next to two coworkers she'd never met. And sitting in her original seat, Vanessa, Ryan's ex-girlfriend, not just any ex. The ex he once admitted he'd almost proposed to. I stared at the chart for a full minute before asking the planner if she'd made a mistake. She looked confused and said, "Ryan requested the change yesterday." My stomach dropped. I called him immediately. He answered cheerfully, asking if I'd picked up our wedding favors yet. I skipped the small talk. "Why is Vanessa sitting in my mother's seat?" Silence. Then he sighed like I was overreacting. "It's just seating," I replied. "It's not just seating. That's my mom's place." He explained that Vanessa didn't know anyone else attending and would feel awkward sitting with strangers. Apparently, she'd recently gone through a rough breakup and needed support. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So your solution is to move my own mother so your ex feels comfortable at our wedding?" He actually said yes. He insisted it wasn't personal and accused me of making unnecessary drama over one dinner chair. But it wasn't about furniture. It was about priorities. I asked why Vanessa had even been invited. Ryan reminded me that they'd stayed friends after the breakup and that she'd been part of his life for years before we met. That wasn't entirely true. They'd barely spoken during most of our relationship, at least as far as I knew. Suddenly she was attending bridal events, commenting on his social media again, and now getting front row treatment at our wedding. Something wasn't adding up. When I told my maid of honor, Lily, she nearly dropped her coffee. "Wait. Your mom got demoted for the ex." Those words sounded even worse out loud. I wanted to believe Ryan had simply made an unbelievably bad decision, so I offered a compromise. "Vanessa to literally any other table. She can even sit with your college friends." He refused. He said she'd already been informed and changing it now would embarrass her. Apparently embarrassing my mother wasn't a concern. I called my mom that evening, trying to hide how upset I was. Before I could explain, she quietly said, "Sweetheart, Ryan already called me." That surprised me. "What did he say?" He asked if I'd mind switching seats because another guest would appreciate it more. I felt my face burn. "And what did you tell him?" She laughed softly. "I said it's your wedding and I'd sit anywhere." That's exactly who my mom is, kind to a fault, which somehow made the situation hurt even more. The next day, I stopped by Ryan's apartment unannounced. He wasn't home. But his laptop was open on the kitchen counter with a messaging app still running. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was actually looking for a charger I'd left there. Then a notification appeared, "Vanessa, can't wait for Saturday. Thank you for making sure I'm close to you. It'll feel like old times." I froze. Before I could stop myself, I glanced at the conversation. Most of it was harmless jokes and planning logistics. Then I found a message from Ryan. "You'll always have a special place beside me." Maybe he meant emotionally. Maybe he didn't. Either way, it was an incredibly strange thing to send your ex days before marrying someone else. I closed the laptop and drove home with 100 questions racing through my head. That evening, I confronted him again. Instead of apologizing, he got defensive. He accused me of invading his privacy and said I was twisting innocent messages into something sinister. I asked him one simple question. If the roles were reversed, and I invited my ex, gave him my father's seat, and texted him that he'd always have a special place beside me, would you honestly be okay with that? He didn't answer. He just looked away. That silence spoke louder than anything else he'd said. For the first time since our engagement, I wondered whether I actually knew the man I was about to marry. Still, invitations had gone out. Vendors had been paid. Family members had flown across the country. Canceling seemed impossible. So I made one final request. "Fix the seating chart before Saturday." He looked me straight in the eye and said, "No, I wish I could tell you that was the moment I called everything off. But emotions are complicated. You spend years building a future with someone, and part of you keeps hoping they'll come to their senses. Instead, I decided to wait. Maybe seeing everyone together would make him realize how inappropriate this was. Maybe Vanessa herself would insist on moving. Maybe I was worrying for nothing. Saturday morning arrived. The venue looked perfect. White roses lined the aisle, sunlight reflected off the lake, and guests smiled as they took their seats. Then my cousin hurried over with an expression I'd never forget. She leaned in and whispered, "You need to come outside, right now." When I stepped into the parking lot, I saw Ryan unloading boxes from his car. Vanessa was helping him, laughing, holding his suit jacket. And when he noticed me watching, he handed her the bouquet that was supposed to be delivered to the bridal suite and asked, with a grin, "Can you keep this safe for me?" That's when every uneasy feeling I'd ignored over the past week came crashing down all at once. I stood there for a second, trying to convince myself I was reading too much into an innocent moment. Maybe she was just helping. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why his ex was carrying his things while my bridesmaids were running around looking for him. But then Vanessa noticed me, smiled politely, and waved with the kind of confidence that made it seem like she belonged there. I nodded back, turned around, and walked inside before I said something I couldn't take back. Lily found me packing the bridal suite. "You look like you're about to cancel this wedding." "I might." She didn't laugh. Instead, she asked the question nobody else had dared to ask. "Do you trust him?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I wasn't sure. Not because I thought he was secretly planning to run away with Vanessa, but because every conversation we'd had that week ended the same way. I explained why something hurt me, and he explained why my feelings were inconvenient. That pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, guests began taking their seats. I peeked through the curtain. My mother was exactly where Ryan had assigned her, off to the side, smiling warmly at strangers and pretending everything was fine. Then I spotted Vanessa. She wasn't just sitting in the reserved family section. She was chatting comfortably with Ryan's parents as if she'd been part of the plan all along. His mother even adjusted the centerpiece so Vanessa could see the stage more clearly. My heart sank. Had everyone known except me, the ceremony itself went smoothly. I walked down the aisle, Ryan smiled, and for a brief moment I almost forgot everything. Then the officiant asked us to face our families. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mom standing several rows farther back than she'd been promised, while Vanessa occupied one of the closest seats. That image lodged itself in my mind. After the vows and photos, everyone moved into the reception hall. I tried to focus on greeting relatives, but people kept making comments. An aunt whispered, "I didn't realize Ryan's ex was still so close with the family." One of my coworkers quietly asked if Vanessa was his cousin because she'd been included in so many pictures. I laughed it off each time. Inside, I was counting the minutes until dinner. Finally, guests found their tables. I walked over to the head table and stopped cold. There were only 2 reserved seats directly beside Ryan, mine, and Vanessa's. My mother's place had vanished entirely. Someone had physically removed her name card and replaced it with Vanessa's. No one had warned me. No one had asked. Ryan looked genuinely confused by my reaction. "What?" I held up the seating card. "What is this?" "It's easier this way," he said casually. "Mom's over there anyway." I lowered my voice. "My mother is not over there. She's my family." He rubbed his forehead. "Don't make a scene." I couldn't believe the irony. He had rearranged our wedding around his ex, but somehow I was the one creating drama. Before I could respond, my mom approached us. She'd clearly figured out what happened. She smiled at me, squeezed my hand, and quietly said, "Honey, don't worry about me. Enjoy your day." That sentence almost broke me, because she wasn't upset about losing a chair. She was trying to protect me from having my wedding ruined, and somehow she was the one comforting me. Lily wasn't nearly as diplomatic. She marched over, looked at the place cards, and loudly asked, "Who thought this was a good idea?" Several nearby guests turned around. Ryan immediately blamed the planner. Unfortunately for him, the planner was standing only a few feet away. She stepped forward and calmly said, "These changes were requested personally by the groom yesterday evening." An awkward silence spread across the room. Ryan looked irritated. The planner looked embarrassed. Vanessa stared down at the tablecloth. For the first time all day, she seemed uncomfortable. Then she quietly picked up her place card. "I can sit somewhere else." I expected Ryan to thank her. Instead, he reached for her arm and said, "No, stay here." That single gesture changed the atmosphere. People noticed. Conversations stopped. Even the servers paused for a second. My uncle, who rarely speaks above a whisper, leaned toward my grandfather and muttered, "This is getting strange." He wasn't wrong. I looked around the room and realized every single person was waiting to see what I would do. If I stayed silent, the message was clear. This was acceptable. If I argued, I'd become the bride who fought during her own reception, so I made a different choice. I walked across the room to table 14. I took my mother's hand, and I said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I'd rather sit with the person who's been there for me my entire life." She looked surprised. So would I. We both laughed. A few cousins immediately dragged over extra chairs. Within minutes, half my side of the family had abandoned their assigned tables to join us. The expensive seating chart Ryan had defended so fiercely unraveled in real time. Across the room, he looked stunned. Vanessa quietly stood up, placed her untouched napkin on the table, and slipped outside. I watched through the window as she disappeared toward the garden alone. And that's when Ryan pushed back his chair, stood up without saying a word, and followed her. The moment Ryan walked after Vanessa, the room changed. He wasn't heading toward the kitchen or greeting a late-arriving guest. He was following his ex out of our wedding reception while his brand-new wife sat across the room with her mother. People noticed immediately. Conversations died down. Forks hovered in midair. Even the DJ seemed unsure whether to keep the music going. Lily leaned over and whispered, "Please tell me he's going to ask her to come back inside." I stared at the garden doors. I wish I could. Nearly 10 minutes, neither of them returned. One of Ryan's cousins tried to smooth things over by starting a toast, but nobody was paying attention. Every few seconds, another guest glanced toward the windows. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I walked outside. The evening air was cool, and the garden lights cast long shadows across the path. I could hear voices before I saw them. Ryan was standing near the fountain with Vanessa. She looked upset. He was trying to reassure her. The first sentence I caught was him saying, "I never wanted you to feel pushed out." That was enough to make me stop in my tracks. Vanessa noticed me first. Her expression changed instantly. She stepped back and said, "I think I should leave." Ryan turned around and looked frustrated, not at the situation, but at me for interrupting it. "Can we have one private conversation?" he asked. I folded my arms. Had 10 minutes. Vanessa quietly apologized for causing tension and headed toward the parking lot. As she passed me, she said something unexpected. "I didn't ask for your mother's seat." I believed her. She looked genuinely uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. Before I could respond, she got into her car and drove away. Ryan watched her leave before finally facing me. Now, that question hit harder than he realized, because it revealed that, in his mind, the problem wasn't the choices he'd made. The problem was that someone had objected to them. I answered honestly. "No, I'm standing outside my own wedding reception wondering why my husband spent more energy protecting his ex's feelings than mine." For a second, he looked like he might apologize. Instead, he doubled down. "You always make everything bigger than it is." I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I couldn't think of another response. A guest choosing chicken instead of fish is a small issue. A florist delivering pink roses instead of white is a small issue. Replacing your bride's mother with your former girlfriend at the family table, and then chasing that former girlfriend into the garden during the reception. That wasn't small. By the time we returned inside, the atmosphere had become impossible to ignore. People had started inventing their own explanations. An elderly aunt apparently thought Vanessa was Ryan's sister. One coworker assumed she'd been hired as an event coordinator. A teenage cousin, completely confused, asked why the other bride had left early. I wished I could disappear. The speeches began soon after. Ryan's best man gave a heartfelt toast about loyalty, friendship, and always putting your partner first. Several people exchanged awkward glances. Then it was my mother's turn. She stood up with remarkable grace. She didn't mention the seating chart. She didn't mention Vanessa. She simply smiled and said, "Marriage isn't about choosing the easiest path. It's about choosing each other again and again, especially when it's difficult." Room fell silent. Nobody clapped immediately. Everyone understood there was a deeper meaning behind those words. I looked at Ryan. He stared down at his plate. After dessert, guests drifted onto the dance floor. The band announced the first dance. Ryan reached for my hand. I hesitated, not to embarrass him, not to punish him, but because, for the first time since we'd met, I wasn't certain we were moving in the same direction. We danced anyway. The photographers captured smiling pictures that would probably look perfect in an album. What those photos would never show was the distance that had opened between us over the course of a single day. As the song ended, Lily walked over with my phone. You might want to see this. A family friend had tagged several candid pictures online. Most were harmless. Then I reached the last image. It showed the reception before I arrived. Ryan and Vanessa were standing at the head table together, laughing as they adjusted place cards. From that angle, with no one else nearby, it almost looked as though they were the couple hosting the event. The comments underneath had already started. Beautiful pair. Thought they were getting married. Who's the brunette next to the groom? I locked my phone without replying, because suddenly I wasn't worried about what strangers on the internet believed. I was worried that somewhere along the way, Ryan had forgotten who this wedding was supposed to be about. And deep down, I had the unsettling feeling that the hardest conversation of the night still hadn't happened. The reception was winding down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the real story hadn't even started. Guests were lining up for coffee and cake. Children were chasing each other across the lawn, and the photographer was trying to gather everyone for one last group picture. Ryan acted as if nothing unusual had happened. He smiled for the camera. He thanked relatives for coming. He even joked with the bartender about finally being able to relax. Meanwhile, I felt like I was watching a stranger wear my fiancé's face. When the photographer called for immediate family, another awkward moment unfolded. My mother instinctively stepped forward. So did Vanessa. The poor photographer looked back and forth between them, unsure what to do. Before he could ask, Ryan casually said, "Vanessa, you can stand on this side." Wasn't even the fact that he included her. It was how automatic it seemed, as though she belonged there without question. The photographer glanced at me, silently asking for direction. I smiled politely and said, "Just parents and siblings, please." Vanessa immediately nodded. Problem. She stepped away without arguing. Oddly enough, she handled the situation with more grace than Ryan had all week. After the photos, she came over to me carrying a small gift bag. "I was going to give this to both of you before I left," she said. Inside was a cookbook wrapped in tissue paper with a short handwritten note wishing us happiness. Nothing dramatic, nothing inappropriate, just a simple present. She hesitated before speaking again. "For what it's worth, I didn't know about the seat until I arrived. I assumed your family approved it." I studied her face. She didn't seem defensive. She seemed embarrassed. Then she quietly added, "If I'd known it would upset you, I would have refused." Before I could answer, she wished me luck and headed toward the exit. I watched her leave and realized something unexpected. My frustration wasn't really with her anymore. It was with Ryan. Because every decision that had caused chaos traced back to him. An hour later, the last guests began saying their goodbyes. My grandparents hugged me. My cousins loaded leftover desserts into their cars. My mother kissed my forehead and whispered, "Whatever happens after tonight, make sure you never ignore your instincts." Those words stayed with me. When everyone had finally left, Ryan and I found ourselves alone in the nearly empty reception hall. Half the candles had burned out. Staff members folded chairs in the background. The room that had been filled with laughter all afternoon suddenly felt enormous. Ryan broke the silence first. "I think today went pretty well." I genuinely thought he was joking. "Pretty well, besides a few misunderstandings." I stared at him. "A misunderstanding is ordering the wrong flowers," he sighed. "You're still on the seating thing." I couldn't believe he called it the seating thing. I asked him a question. "If our future daughter got married one day and her fiancé replaced your seat with his ex-girlfriend, would you tell her she was overreacting?" For the first time all evening, he had no immediate answer. He looked out across the empty tables. Then he quietly admitted, "Probably not." Honesty was refreshing, but it came far too late. "I needed you to think about that before today," I said, not after he apologized. It sounded sincere. But apologies don't erase moments that reveal priorities. We drove to the hotel in near silence. The suite was beautiful, rose petals on the bed, sparkling water chilling in a bucket, city lights stretching across the windows. Months earlier, I'd imagined laughing there with my new husband until sunrise. Instead, we sat on opposite sides of the room. Eventually, Ryan asked the question neither of us wanted to face. "You regretting marrying me?" I didn't answer immediately, because regret wasn't the right word. I was disappointed, confused, and suddenly aware that the biggest challenge in our relationship wasn't his friendship with an ex. It was his inability to understand why certain boundaries mattered. "I'm regretting that we didn't have this conversation before the wedding." I finally said. He nodded slowly. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, my phone buzzed with dozens of messages from guests thanking us for the celebration. Mixed among them was one text from the planner. It read, "I wanted you to know I kept copies of every seating revision. All of the final changes came directly from Ryan. I thought you should have that information in case anyone says otherwise." I thanked her and put my phone down, not because I planned to argue with anyone, but because the truth had become impossible to ignore. No planner had made a mistake. No guest had forced a last-minute change. No misunderstanding had spiraled out of control. One person had made a series of deliberate choices, believing they were reasonable. And those choices had transformed what should have been one of the happiest days of my life into the beginning of a much larger conversation about trust, respect, and whether love alone is enough when two people see those things so differently.